Here begins the narration of Foundation. Anoxania didn't need the latest generation of high-visibility heads-up display and auto-target suggestion. That all just got in the way of a simple reticle. She hated the annoying chatter of a personal assistant and turned it off when her last software patch installed it as default. She had only to listen to its systems, and her suit had its own voice. Everything else was powered down. Humming at a new pitch, the power core of her mecha exoskeleton deep-cycled from being barely able to deflect blasts and vertically thrust into the reserves necessary to power secondary weapons and lift engines. Laser fire scorched lines of glass into the newly terraformed landscapes she had found cover in to buy enough time. The enemy, monsters by anyone's estimation, had spent the last several minutes giving chase. Her jibing actions had saved her life several times, but were ultimately meant to gather them into an ever-narrowing arc. Close enough to warrant it, and too ineffective to gun her down, they grew frustrated enough to cascade into a berserking mob, shifting to show their true selves. Guns were traded for claws and fangs, and they charged the remaining distance. Other pilots might have broken cover to tack across their perimeter at melee, boldly cut swaths through them, or perhaps keep to a distance for circle strafing into their mass. Instead, she tensed and boosted. Looking up at the alien sky, she stretched her thrusters out like wings. Feathers of smoke curled out behind a swarm of mini-missiles. Briefly hanging in midair by the momentum of their initial launch, they coordinated attack areas before springing to life, driven by individual targeting and evasion systems. They descended into an area that thunderously erupted in fire, and then became shrouded by smoke and sand. She had a loadout for this specific tactic. With thrusters tuned to boost for height and missiles spec'd for both targeting and area, there was no such thing as cover from her. The problem was the energy requirement. The triple chirp of her core's emergency alarm rang out, and she dropped hard. Heavies can't glide, not really. At best, they can skim. They can't fly, but they can fall, and she picked a survivor to land on, splitting it in half with her shield. Even from that height, her hydraulics shrugged off the force of this action with ease. Her sword was out before she landed, ready for any that remained. Their leaders slain, the beasts charged mindlessly into her sweeping lines of light and steel. Though most politely say otherwise, when the moment truly comes, as her adrenaline and victorious pride confirmed for her, every warrior lusts for the melee. With one thruster mostly wrecked and a core too damaged to provide more than half power, she turned to lurch triumphantly home. She stopped dead to look across a line of reinforcements. She had been funneled into an ambush. But they weren't shooting and weren't even advancing. She wondered if they had some sense of honor. She let her mind segment into three in the moment of preparation. One was closed, heated by immediacy but tempered by tactics, training, and experience. Another remained open, exploratory and distracted, but invaluably intuitive. The third was the endless calm that listened between the two. The confidence of a tried-and-true strategy allows for thoughtless execution, but that isn't good enough when things get serious. Limited in that way, the inexperienced lock up when unable to reach for matching tactics in a rapidly changing battlefield. But for the experienced, and she was among their very best, the brain ramps up as a creative side also springs to life, making time seem to slow. Her left mind was thumbing through its tome of available tools, calculating probabilities and timings, and matching them with known enemy capabilities. It had decided to redirect energy to prefer mobility over shields to close the distance. It reasoned that her energy shields wouldn't withstand a lucky shot, her melee weapon was already extended, and she could engage enemies that would be momentarily vulnerable or delayed while shifting forms to cope with her close proximity. It was measuring the cooldown time for rocket reloading, and was planning a limit to her horizontal thruster use to reserve some for the necessary height. It was preparing to balance between thrust capability, blast radius, and remaining armor. A cold corner of her mind quietly calculated sacrificing some of her own health. Hospitalization was better than death. Her right mind was daydreaming questions. Could they see her grit, then bare her teeth? Did they think there was a second face in this mecha's chest? Can they know fear? It noted they were hesitating. The bridge between her two minds found their moment of agreement, and that inner Anaxania whispered, "Now." Thump. The enemy wasn't hesitating, they were waiting. Maybe they wondered if she could know fear. She went pale and, though her mecha remained steady, her hands went loose at its controls. Thump. It took one long breath for her to regain composure. That was one of the greater kaiju, and with luck it would only be 4 times her size. She had a problem, the only one that mattered to her ilk, to flee or fight. Nobody would be the wiser if she did the former, and nobody would know her sacrifice if she did the latter. It wasn't a choice to her, this was the right way to go. There was a half-built forward operating base not far from her position, and though it didn't have civilians, her people had none. It wasn't a stronghold capable of fending off the full force she just found. She knew her valiance might give it a chance, and wondered that if she dented the enemy forces enough, if the base's scant defenses could be effective enough to fend off those remaining. Could, she worried. Would, she decided. Thump. Turning and hunching within her suit, she tightened the grip on her controls until her knuckles went white. She grinned wickedly and thought, "These snakes don't know who they're dealing with. There's a reason I'm call-signed Mongoose." Thump. She planned to dance around the other side of the mound she was leaned against, using it as cover from the new forces to boost out of range and make a mad dash for their kaiju tank. If she was lucky, she wondered, she'd surprise them, get right in the midst of them for a hail of rockets and then detonate. It would be glorious. The thing about humans is sometimes we take risks, maybe big ones. The other is sometimes we're smart, or skilled, or lucky. Anaxania's people are the survivors of the already elite, and we're all those things. With no home world to return to, terraforming this planet and suppressing these invaders was their only chance for survival. Time in her mind's eye had slowed enough for that hard life to begin flashing before it. The inevitability of the moment had created a faux silence as her ears dimmed to everything unimportant, a silence that was pierced by the shrill cries of incoming mortars. Their placement was smart, skilled, and lucky. She was already turned with her shield to the enemy, and it gave her clamshell-like cover between it and the mound she was next to. When the largest explosive fell on top of her ambushers, she was already perfectly positioned to angle the wake of fire over her. Whoever fired that mortar knew how she should be positioned and where to drop the bomb, and both the shooter and her were lucky enough that, though she was roughly pressed into the mound by the force of the blast, she survived otherwise unscathed. The rest of the projectiles took a higher arc over her position, landing in the field she had just decimated to raise enough additional dust to give visual cover for her mad dash. Following ruts in the broken landscape, she made herself a less tempting target than her reinforcements. A too bright red mecha streaked by overhead. The pilot's flight suit shifted through glowing shades of red and magenta, leaving an annoying streak across the eyes of anyone who looked up at her in this full-burn flight. There was no mistaking that pilot, that was the point. Katya was something like the other side of Anaxania's coin. Instead of leveraging defenses and tactics, she had abandoned all sense of reason for mobility, sacrificing most of her shields for the jets she now used to chase just behind the mortars. She didn't care about the front line, zipping overhead with enough speed for the Doppler effect to pitch shift the sound of her many thrusters. Anaxania, taking a moment to check her bearings and safety, looked up to see that the land-borne enemy had been futilely flinging grappling hooks past her, but that her focus on angling up for more height left her vulnerable to a lucky hook. It easily pierced her energy shield. It was designed for projectiles and energy weapons, and its chain pulled taut to bring her down. Katya shut her maneuvering thrusters down, and her mecha's inner fuel channels pivoted to new purpose. When the chain began yanking, she turned her primary thrusters on an angle that mimicked a fish trying to escape a line. Secondary vents opened in ridges along her frame, spraying a fine mist into an aura. Spark crystals clicked away. The enemy hadn't caught a fish, they pulled down a meteor. She descended with thrusters that closed the distance faster than the chain could retract. Grabbing onto it at several points, she pulled to change her angle in unpredictable arcs. The Hellcat dropped like a second sunset behind the ridge. Anaxenia continued her withdrawal. Quick handshake tones echoed into her headset when she tripped a point-to-point whisper laser line. Auto-negotiating her into the group, the slight figure of a mecha shimmered into existence next to her when her display system decoded the data stream. The stealther was standing deathly still, looking past her, holding ready a short blade in each hand. She recognized the man in the suit. Nice guy, talked too much, terrible poker face. She couldn't remember his name, though. Gaining access to a coordinated battlefield map, she noted a sniper some distance away. He was laying down, holding out an oversized slug rifle. He was obvious to her, even at that distance, but stealth tech was his specialty, and the enemy would have no idea he was watching. Doesn't talk much, smiles without showing his teeth, likes her a lot, shows it with his eyes. Jeff, John, something like that. And Anaxenia decided she'd owe him a drink for spotting for those mortars. Though she could see figures gliding toward her, Anaxenia was surprised to see a frontline engineer first. He had already set up a turret, which was tirelessly scanning for the targets almost on her heels. Working to upgrade it, he ignored her completely. Her safety would be incidental. He'd be more focused on protecting it than her. Engineers, she sighed to herself with faux exasperation. Soon he'd have a minor area of denial set up, with turrets positioned in odd nooks and pointed in calculated angles and arcs to protect one another. She could now turn her attention to attend to her suit with a repair station that he had half set up. She didn't know him, but he was clearly new to engineering. A station like that was too valuable to place close to the action, and the two of them wouldn't be enough if reinforcements didn't arrive soon. The station sprang to life, but it was only minimally equipped, focusing more on ammo than critical systems. He was apparently the sort that focused on dropping more turrets than proper stations. Another engineer, of a sort, blinked into existence. Anaxenia grinned near to tears. Though she had been as cold as ever when they first met, especially when Eva had repeatedly teased her with the nickname Anya, they had since developed a powerful bond. Eva had been pissing her off intentionally to build on the surprise of their proper battlefield introduction. Pushing into Anya's personal space in the heat of the melee, she revealed surprising ability and a focus on an unsettling combination of technologies. With shields too thin for open combat, she relied on their rapid regeneration and the cover granted by others to close distances behind them. Though her sidearm was perfectly capable against the average mid-range target, it was annoying or even insulting against hard targets. It didn't matter to her. She was a team player, fighting alongside heavies, with or without their permission, as a support. Leveraging a short-range teleport, she had learned to weave in and out of a mob with the skill that Katya was proud to have inspired, using the energy lance Anya would later design for her. It was the sort of thank you present a fighter thinks to give to a healer. Though Eva stayed so poorly armed as to practically be a non-combatant, she focused entirely on the tools she brought to bear just then. Bangles of metal unlocked from her forearms, levitating on sparks of electricity. With her hands lit up blue-green, she reached tendrils toward Anaxenia. Performing a function opposite their usual use, her shields pulled in the energy, regenerating core reserves and powering her self-repair systems back up to full action. Eva was exactly the sort of partner Anaxenia had always wanted. Reunited, now there was no mob that could challenge the pair. Though he was a far cry from Katya's insanity, Joshua was getting there. Still too resource-poor to properly paint his suit, he had been focusing on very rare laser technologies. So far he had only learned to make an SMG, but he fell in love with it and immediately made a second. They were out right now, and he was flooding the air with a hail of energy that, from his height, hadn't begun hitting the ground. When he landed, he'd join the turrets in engaging the first wave of enemies who were restarting the fight. He wouldn't let go of a trigger for its entire duration, switching from left to right and back again as an SMG cooled down. He didn't care about ammo, his guns didn't use any. He also didn't care about aiming. He had a rate of fire that made a chain gunner blush, sending slivers of light piercing through several enemies before fuzzing out of combat value. A ways behind him were a few more figures. One had just dropped a jump pad for the height to fly a little higher and further to send careful bursts of automatic rifle fire to cover Katya's cackling retreat. Eddie was the sort who kept a mental note of shots on target, was OCD about reloading, and used the gun point blank. Anya turned when she heard the unique timing and sound of Jeff's slug thrower. Yes, Jeff was his name, she remembered. Someone had called him G-Off after his anti-gravity-like jumps. He could reach perches which most enemies couldn't climb. His buddy would be the one to fend off anyone coming up for him. Though alongside the assault mecha, Phil was unable to do more than tug on his trigger in annoyance at their distance. His chain cannon would wind up, then spin down, only occasionally shooting a bolt or two to check for range. He had an energy weapon of a sort, and though it was a terror in a class all its own, it wasn't Joshua's laser tech, and he grew jealous to the point of anger at his ammo woes. His mic would sometimes open for one of his growls, since he didn't have the weapon reserves to lean into a lane of fire just once to relieve his frustration. He'd be okay once he landed to vent his anger. The opposite was true of the Canadair just behind the two. Whoever it was couldn't reach anything in particular, but didn't care the least. Plasma balls were being tossed in arcs between springing and bounding, and at nothing in particular, as though keeping the pilot in practice at every opportunity. Anya could imagine the exclaims of "wee," which was confirmed when one came across voice chat. He'd probably run out of ammo before engaging the enemy, but he was used to the ebb and flow of exhausting ammo, switching to a secondary gun until he could salvage some more, and then carrying on. His various thrusters would have charge times, and between that and his ammo use, his combat constantly waned into landlocked boredom and then waxed into plasma-fueled mania. Behind them all was a heavy who had just made it across a nearby rift in the landscape. There must be a thermal vent there, Anya reasoned, for him or her to make it across. In one smooth motion, the mecha landed into a skim thrust. Its shields popped away into a burst of light as its generators were repurposed for even more speed. Fire trailed behind it as thrusters pushed the frame into catching up. Anya knew it would be a hard fight, even with the reinforcements. At least now, she nodded to herself, they would all be witnesses for one another's glory. Finally repaired, her comm systems connected to the orbiting station. Her earpiece flatly continued, 8R. Beacon acquired. Recommend zone exit. Entry in 5. Anya looked up as the cylinder entered. It glowed from what friction it found in the thin atmosphere. 4. Its red underbelly brightened from its descent thrusters. 3. Smoke billowed out from disposable secondary thrusters, adjusting its angle. 2. It began to unfold into its humanoid shape. 1. Anya saw the kaiju and its support forces met by their greatest weapon. With next to no atmospheric buoyancy to slow it, she could feel it land even at her distance. If they could defend it for long enough to mine the resources they had discovered, they would go from surviving an obliterated homeworld and being stranded in a wasteland to pushing against this unknown enemy, past the walls of a faintly terraformed crater, and founding a proper colony. This was written and narrated by Saeed Ali. You can find me and more of my work at worldswithwords.com. Thank you for listening.